Homeless girl asks Elon Musk for food. His reaction changes her life forever. The busy streets of downtown buzzed with life. As professionals hustled to their offices, cars zipped by, and the cold wind carried the sound of distant conversations. Amidst the sea of activity, few noticed the young girl huddled on the sidewalk, her belongings packed into a small, tattered suitcase by her side. Wrapped in an oversized coat and a mismatched scarf, she sat cross-legged on the cold concrete, her eyes darting between passers-by as she clutched an empty paper bag for warmth. Her name was Mia, and at only 14 years old, life had already dealt her more challenges than most adults could fathom. She had been living on the streets for months now, forced to beg for scraps to survive. Most people walked past her without a second glance, their eyes fixed on their phones or the pavement. The occasional sneer or dismissive glare only served to remind her of her invisibility and the rare moments of kindness, like the half-eaten sandwich a stranger had handed her the night before, felt like drops of rain in a desert. Today felt no different. The cold air bit at her cheeks, and her stomach growled with a hunger she had long since grown used to. She adjusted her scarf and scanned the crowd, searching for a face that might show even the smallest hint of compassion. Her gaze landed on a man stepping out of a sleek electric car parked just a few feet away. He was tall, dressed in a leather jacket and jeans, and carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. Mia didn't recognize him. How could she, when her world was so far removed from his? The man paused for a moment, glancing up at the tall office building in front of him before reaching into his pocket to pull out a set of keys. Mia hesitated, her heart pounding. She had learned to read people, to sense whether they were approachable or hostile. This man seemed different. There was a warmth in his posture, a lack of the usual rush or impatience she saw in others. Summoning her courage, Mia called out to him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice shaky but audible over the noise of the street. I haven't eaten today. Do you have anything to spare? Even just a little bit." The man turned, his expression unreadable as he looked at her. For a brief moment, Mia felt a pang of regret. What if he ignored her? Or worse, what if he responded with anger like so many others had? But instead, his gaze softened, and he took a step closer. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. "Mia," she replied, clutching the paper bag tighter. I don't mean to bother you. You're not bothering me," he interrupted gently. He crouched down to her level, his eyes meeting hers. "Are you here by yourself?" Mia nodded, unsure of how much to say. She had learned to be cautious, to protect herself from prying questions and judgment. But something about this man's tone made her feel safe, as though he genuinely wanted to help. Before she could answer further, the moment was interrupted by a sharp voice from behind. "Hey, buddy, you might not want to get too close. You never know what these people are carrying." Mia flinched at the words, her cheeks burning with shame. The comment came from a sharply dressed woman in a pencil skirt and blazer, her heels clicking loudly against the pavement as she approached. She shot Mia a disdainful glance, her nose wrinkling as though the girl's very presence was an affront to her. The man straightened, his calm demeanor unshaken. "These people?" he repeated, his tone measured but with an unmistakable edge. The woman crossed her arms, unfazed. "Look, I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking. You shouldn't encourage them. It only makes the problem worse." Mia's heart sank, her gaze dropping to the ground. She had heard it all before. The muttered insults, the dismissive comments. But hearing it in front of this man, who had shown her a sliver of kindness, felt like a fresh wound. The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he turned back to Mia and crouched down again. "Mia, are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her trembling hands betrayed her. "I'm used to it," she whispered. "You shouldn't have to be," he replied, his voice filled with quiet determination. The woman let out an exasperated sigh. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "You're wasting your time. These people don't want help. They just want handouts." Mia's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, unwilling to let the woman see her cry. The man stood, his expression calm but resolute as he turned to face the woman. "Do you know her story?" he asked, his tone even. "Do you know what she's been through?" The woman scoffed. "I don't need to know. It's always the same with these types. Bad choices, bad luck, it doesn't matter. They end up here because they put themselves here." A ripple of discomfort passed through the nearby crowd, which had begun to take notice of the interaction. Some people slowed their steps, curious to see how the confrontation would unfold. Others shook their heads and kept walking, unwilling to involve themselves. The man didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed Mia a crisp $20 bill and said, "This is for now, but let's find a way to get you something more permanent." Mia's hands trembled as she accepted the money, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. Thank you so much." The woman rolled her eyes. "See? Exactly what I was talking about. You're just enabling her." The man turned to her, his calm demeanor unwavering. "And what have you done to help?" he asked simply. The woman's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication, as the crowd grew silent. Mia watched the exchange with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She didn't know who this man was or why he had chosen to stand up for her, but in that moment, he felt like a lifeline in a sea of indifference. And though she didn't know it yet, this encounter was only the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever. The tension in the air was palpable as the sharply dressed woman crossed her arms and narrowed her gaze at the man, clearly unwilling to back down. Though her words had already drawn disapproving glances from a few passers-by, her confidence was unshaken. She seemed to thrive on confrontation, her polished exterior betraying none of the cracks that come with doubt or introspection. "You think you're doing something noble," she said, her tone clipped, "but all you're really doing is rewarding laziness. There are programs, shelters, resources for people like her. She could easily walk into one of them if she actually wanted help." Mia shrank under the weight of the woman's words, her fingers clutching the $20 bill as though it might disappear. The man, Elon, though no one yet realized his identity, turned to look at her, a soft yet steady resolve in his eyes. He didn't respond to the woman immediately. Instead, he crouched back down to Mia's level. "Is that true?" he asked gently. "Do you know where to find help?" Mia hesitated, her lips trembling as she searched for the right words. "Sometimes," she murmured, her voice barely audible, "but it's not always safe. Some places." She stopped, her voice catching in her throat. "It's okay," Elon said softly. "Take your time." The woman rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please," she said. "Don't let her play the victim. These people know exactly what they're doing. They've made an entire lifestyle out of manipulating people like you." Mia flinched, her face flushing with shame. She wasn't manipulating anyone. She had learned early on that asking for help came with judgment, but this was a new level of cruelty. Her voice shook as she finally found the courage to speak. "I'm not lying," she said, her words directed at the woman. "I've been to shelters. Some are good, but some are dangerous. They're not what you think." The woman scoffed. "Oh, right, dangerous," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess. This is the part where you tell some sob story to make us all feel sorry for you?" "That's enough," Elon said, standing once more. His tone was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it now. The quiet strength in his voice was enough to make the woman hesitate, though she quickly masked it with another sneer. "What?" she said. "Am I supposed to feel guilty for stating the obvious? You're the one making a spectacle out of this. If you really wanted to help, you'd take her to one of those programs instead of handing her cash like some savior." Elon tilted his head slightly, studying the woman with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. "It's easy to talk about programs and resources," he said, "when you've never had to rely on them yourself." The woman bristled, her cheeks reddening. "And what would you know about it?" she shot back. "You're not exactly struggling to pay your bills, are you?" Elon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around at the small crowd that had gathered, their curious eyes shifting between him and the woman. Some whispered quietly among themselves, while others simply watched, their expressions a mix of intrigue and unease. "I know enough to listen," he said finally, his voice steady. "And right now, Mia is telling us that those resources aren't always safe. That matters." "Oh, give me a break," the woman said, throwing her hands up. "You're buying into her excuses. People like her will say anything to avoid taking responsibility for their own lives." Mia's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She was used to judgment, but the harshness of this woman's words cut deeper than most. She opened her mouth to respond, but Elon spoke first. "Do you always assume the worst about people?" he asked, his tone quiet but pointed. The woman blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I don't assume anything," she said quickly. "I just call it like I see it." "And what do you see?" Elon asked, his gaze unwavering. "A young girl trying to survive on her own? Or an easy target for your frustration?" The woman's mouth opened, but no words came out. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and a few people nodded in agreement with Elon's words. The balance of power in the interaction was shifting, though the woman was clearly determined not to lose control. "You don't know anything about me," she said finally, her voice tight. "So don't stand there and act like you're better than me." "This isn't about being better than anyone," Elon replied. "It's about being kind, about recognizing someone's humanity instead of tearing them down." The woman's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, a new voice cut through the crowd. "Excuse me," said an older man with a weathered face and a heavy coat. He stepped forward, his expression serious. "I've been on these streets. I know what it's like. And let me tell you, the shelters aren't always what they're cracked up to be. This girl's telling the truth." The woman's eyes widened, her confidence visibly shaken as the man continued. "People like her don't need your judgment," he said. "They need a break. Someone to show them a little kindness." The crowd murmured in agreement, and the woman's gaze darted around, as though searching for someone to back her up. But the faces staring back at her were unsympathetic, their expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disdain. Elon stepped closer to Mia, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said softly. "Your story matters, no matter what anyone else says." Mia nodded, her tears finally spilling over. For the first time in months, she felt seen, not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be dismissed, but as a person with worth and dignity. The woman, meanwhile, had fallen silent. Her shoulders were tense, and her lips pressed into a thin line as she stood frozen in place. The weight of the crowd's judgment was now on her, and for the first time, she seemed to feel its sting. Elon didn't look at her again. His focus remained on Mia, his presence a steady source of reassurance amidst the chaos. And though the moment was far from resolved, it was clear that the tide was turning, and that this encounter would have consequences far beyond the park. The tension hung thick in the air as the woman, still glaring, folded her arms across her chest. Though the murmurs of disapproval from the crowd were becoming louder, she seemed unwilling to back down. Her pride had been wounded, and her anger simmered just below the surface. It was no longer just about Mia or the situation at hand. It was about her need to win, to feel in control. "Let me tell you something," she snapped, pointing a manicured finger at Elon. "Kindness doesn't pay the bills. All your high and mighty talk about empathy doesn't change the fact that people like her are a drain on society. You can throw money at the problem all you want, but it won't fix anything." A gasp rippled through the crowd, and Mia recoiled as though the words had physically struck her. Her eyes darted to Elon, searching his face for reassurance. He remained calm, though his jaw tightened slightly, a subtle but telling sign of his growing frustration. "Kindness doesn't pay the bills," Elon repeated, his voice steady but sharp. "Is that really what you believe? That we should measure someone's worth by their financial contributions?" The woman's lips curled into a sneer. "It's not about worth," she said. "It's about reality. You can't just go around handing out money and expect the world to change. People like her need to pull themselves up. No one's going to do it for them." Elon's gaze didn't waver. "Pull themselves up with what?" he asked. "With no home? No safety net? no access to basic resources. Tell me, how would you pull yourself up if you lost everything tomorrow? The woman opened her mouth, but no response came. For a moment, she seemed genuinely caught off guard, as though the possibility of her own vulnerability had never crossed her mind. But the moment passed quickly, and her expression hardened. "That's not the point," she said, her voice rising. "The point is, people need to take responsibility for their own lives. I've worked hard for everything I have, and I'm not about to feel guilty for it." "No one's asking you to feel guilty," Elon replied. "We're asking you to feel human." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and the woman's face flushed with anger. She turned to the bystanders, gesturing wildly as if to rally their support. "Are you all just going to stand here and let him lecture us? What about our struggles? What about the people who work hard and still can't get ahead? Why should we be expected to carry the burden for people who won't even try?" The crowd stirred uneasily, but no one stepped forward to back her up. Most avoided her gaze, their discomfort evident. A few people shook their heads, their expressions a mix of disapproval and pity. "You're not carrying anyone's burden," Elon said, his tone calm but firm. "This isn't about you. It's about Mia, a child who's been left to fend for herself in a world that's supposed to protect her." The woman's nostrils flared, and she jabbed a finger toward Mia, who shrank back under the weight of her gaze. "Don't act like she's some helpless victim," she spat. "She's playing you just like they all do. I've seen it before. They'll take whatever they can get from you and disappear the second you're no longer useful." Mia's eyes filled with tears, and she hugged her knees to her chest, her small frame trembling. The cruelty of the woman's words was like a physical blow, each one hitting harder than the last. But before she could say anything, Elon stepped forward, his presence shielding Mia from the woman's venom. "Enough," he said, his voice low but commanding. The single word silenced not only the woman but the entire crowd. All eyes were on him now, the weight of his authority impossible to ignore. "You don't know her story," he continued, his tone steady but laced with quiet anger. "You don't know what she's been through, what she's had to endure just to survive. And yet you stand here judging her as if you have the right. Tell me, what does that say about you?" The woman's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their gazes bouncing between Elon and the woman as though waiting for someone to break the stalemate. Finally, she let out a bitter laugh, though it lacked any real humor. "You think you're so much better than me," she said, "but you're just another do-gooder with a savior complex. You swoop in, throw some money around, and pat yourself on the back like you've changed the world. Meanwhile, the rest of us have to live with the consequences of your bleeding heart." "I'm not trying to change the world," Elon said simply. "I'm trying to change her world. And if that makes me a do-gooder, then so be it." The woman's face twisted with rage, and she took a step closer, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "You'll regret this," she said. "Mark my words. People like her will bleed you dry." Elon didn't flinch. "I'll take my chances," he replied, his tone unyielding. The crowd erupted into murmurs once more, their disapproval of the woman now palpable. A few people whispered among themselves, casting sidelong glances in her direction. It was clear that the tide had turned, and the woman was quickly losing whatever shred of credibility she had left. Mia, meanwhile, sat in stunned silence, her wide eyes fixed on Elon. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Someone standing up for her, defending her against the harsh judgments she had grown so accustomed to. It felt surreal, like a dream she might wake up from at any moment. But this was no dream. This was real. And though Mia didn't yet fully understand who this man was or why he had chosen to help her, one thing was certain. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't have imagined. The woman's bitterness only seemed to deepen as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Her once confident posture now appeared slightly rigid, but her expression remained defiant. It was clear she wasn't willing to back down, especially now that her pride was on the line. She scanned the onlookers, her gaze hardening as she sought validation among them. But all she saw were judgmental faces and sidelong glances that carried no sympathy for her stance. She turned back to Elon, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think you're making a difference here? All you're doing is setting a dangerous precedent. You give people like her handouts, and then they expect it from everyone. What happens when you're not here to play hero?" Elon's calm demeanor didn't falter. "A dangerous precedent," he repeated, his tone measured. "The only danger here is the lack of empathy. What kind of society do we create when we treat kindness as a weakness?" The woman scoffed, gesturing toward Mia as if she were an object in a debate rather than a person. "Oh, please, let's stop pretending she's some innocent victim. She's out here for a reason. Bad decisions, bad habits. It's not my fault she ended up like this." Mia's cheeks burned with humiliation, her grip tightening on the crumpled $20 bill in her hand. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but her throat felt tight, and the words refused to come. Her gaze dropped to the ground, and she wished more than anything to disappear. Elon, however, refused to let the woman's cruelty go unchecked. "And what bad decisions do you think she made?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge of challenge. "Do you know anything about her life, her circumstances, or is it easier for you to assume the worst?" The woman hesitated for a split second before doubling down. "I don't need to know her story to see the obvious," she snapped. "People like her don't end up on the streets for no reason. It's always drugs, crime, or sheer laziness. Take your pick." The crowd stirred uncomfortably at her words, some shaking their heads in disapproval. A man near the back muttered, "That's a bit harsh," while another whispered, "She doesn't even know the girl." The woman either didn't hear or chose to ignore the comments, her focus locked on Elon. "And what if it's none of those things?" Elon pressed. "What if she's here because the system failed her? What if it's because people like you failed her?" The woman's face flushed, and her lips tightened into a thin line. "I didn't fail anyone," she said defensively. "I worked hard for everything I have. No one handed me anything. If I can do it, so can she." Elon tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her shift uneasily. "You think your success makes you superior," he said quietly. "But success doesn't make someone better. It just makes them luckier." "Luck?" she echoed, her voice rising. "Don't insult me. My success has nothing to do with luck. It's about hard work, determination, and making the right choices." "Choices," Elon repeated, his tone thoughtful. "Tell me, did you choose the family you were born into? Did you choose to have access to education, opportunities, or a safety net? Or were those things given to you?" The woman opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her confidence wavered for the first time, her eyes darting to the crowd as though searching for support. But the onlookers remained silent, their expressions ranging from contemplative to disapproving. Elon didn't wait for her to recover. He stepped closer, his voice steady but firm. "Mia didn't choose to lose her parents," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "She didn't choose to grow up in foster care or to be thrown out when she aged out of the system. She didn't choose to sleep on the streets because there was nowhere else to go. Those weren't choices. They were circumstances beyond her control." The woman faltered, her bravado slipping as the weight of his words settled over her. But she wasn't ready to admit defeat. Instead, she crossed her arms and muttered, "That's not my problem. And that," Elon said, his voice sharp now, "is exactly the problem." The crowd stirred again, a few people nodding in agreement. The woman's cheeks reddened further, and she took a step back as if trying to put distance between herself and the growing judgment of those around her. But her anger refused to let her retreat entirely. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice shaking with frustration. "You're all acting like I'm the villain here. I'm just saying what everyone else is too afraid to say." A voice from the crowd spoke up, clear and firm. "No, you're just saying what no one else is cruel enough to say." The woman spun around, her eyes narrowing on the source of the comment. A middle-aged man in a worn jacket, his expression one of quiet disapproval. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped. "I know enough," the man replied calmly. I know that it's easier to judge someone than to help them. And I know that people like you make the world harder for people like her." The woman's mouth opened, but whatever retort she had died in her throat. The crowd was no longer on her side, and the realization seemed to hit her all at once. Her confidence crumbled further, and for the first time, she looked genuinely uncertain. Elon, however, remained composed. He turned back to Mia, crouching down once more. "You don't have to listen to her," he said gently. "None of what she said is true. You're stronger than you know, and you deserve so much more than this." Mia nodded, her tears finally spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for believing in me." Elon smiled softly, his presence a steady source of reassurance. "It's not just me," he said, glancing at the crowd. "Look around. There are more people willing to help than you think." The crowd murmured in agreement, and a few people stepped forward, offering kind words and small gestures of support. The woman, meanwhile, stood frozen, her once dominant presence reduced to a faint shadow. But the moment of reckoning had yet to arrive, and the tension in the air hinted that the worst was still to come. The crowd continued to grow, murmurs spreading like ripples in a pond as onlookers tried to piece together the unfolding drama. The tension between Elon and the woman hung heavy in the air, a battle of ideologies playing out in the middle of the busy street. Yet, despite the crowd's growing disapproval, the woman seemed determined to hold her ground. She adjusted the strap of her expensive handbag and stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her gaze locked onto Elon, her voice low but laced with venom. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" she hissed, swooping in to save the day, making yourself look good in front of all these people. "But let's be honest, you don't care about her. You're just here for the attention." The accusation drew audible gasps from the crowd, and several heads turned to see Elon's reaction. Mia froze, her wide eyes darting between the two as if she were caught in the middle of a storm. Elon, however, remained composed, his expression unreadable as he met the woman's gaze. "This isn't about me," he said evenly. "It's about her." "Oh, please," the woman sneered. "Spare me the self-righteous act. You're no different from the rest of us. You just want to feel better about yourself by throwing money at the problem and walking away." Elon tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "And what are you doing to solve the problem?" he asked, his voice calm but pointed. The question seemed to catch her off guard, and for a moment she faltered. But her defiance quickly returned, and she crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "I don't have to solve anything," she snapped. "It's not my responsibility to fix other people's messes." Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd, and a few onlookers shook their heads. The middle-aged man from earlier, who had spoken in Mia's defense, stepped forward again, his voice firm but measured. "No one's asking you to fix anything," he said. "But there's a difference between not helping and tearing someone down. You're going out of your way to be cruel, and for what? To prove a point." The woman's face flushed, and she turned on him with a glare. "You don't know anything about me," she snapped. "So don't stand there and act like you're better than me." The man held her gaze, unflinching. "I'm not better than anyone," he said simply. "But I know what it's like to be in her shoes. And I know how much it hurts when people like you treat us like we're nothing." The woman opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice chimed in, this time, a young woman with a baby in her arms. "He's right," she said, her tone soft but firm. "I was homeless once, and the only thing that got me through it was the kindness of strangers. People like you don't realize how much your words can hurt." The crowd nodded in agreement, and the woman's defiance began to crumble. She glanced around, her eyes darting from one disapproving face to another. The weight of their judgment was palpable, and for the first time, she seemed to realize that she was outnumbered. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking with barely concealed anger. "You all want to play the heroes? Go ahead. But don't come crying to me when people like her take advantage of your kindness and leave you with nothing." Mia flinched at the words, her hands trembling as she clutched the crumpled bill. She had heard it all before. The accusations, the assumptions, the cruel stereotypes. but hearing it in front of so many people felt like a fresh wound. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but her voice refused to come. Elon, however, was not about to let the woman's words go unchallenged. "Kindness isn't a transaction," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It's not about what you get in return. It's about making the world a little bit better, one small act at a time. And if that makes me naive, then so be it." The crowd erupted into applause, and the woman's face turned an even deeper shade of red. She took a step back, her confidence visibly shaken, but her pride refused to let her admit defeat. "You think you're so wise," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But you're just another bleeding heart with more money than sense. You can afford to be generous. The rest of us don't have that luxury." Elon's expression softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "Generosity isn't about money," he said. "It's about empathy, and that doesn't cost a thing." The crowd murmured in agreement, and the woman's shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of their disapproval. But instead of retreating, she lashed out one final time. "You're all fools," she spat. "You think you're helping her, but you're just enabling her. People like her will never change. They'll take and take until there's nothing left." The words hung in the air, heavy and venomous. Mia's tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands, her small frame shaking with silent sobs. The crowd fell silent, their anger and frustration now mingled with pity for the girl who had been the target of such cruelty. Elon stepped closer to Mia, crouching down so that his face was level with hers. "Mia," he said gently, his voice cutting through the silence like a bomb. "Look at me." She hesitated, then slowly lifted her tear-streaked face to meet his gaze. His eyes were kind, filled with a quiet determination that made her feel safe despite the chaos around her. "You're not what she says you are," he said firmly. "You're strong, and you deserve so much more than this." Mia nodded, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Thank you." Elon smiled softly, his presence a steady source of comfort. But as he straightened, his expression hardened once more, his gaze locking onto the woman who had caused so much pain. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice calm but laced with quiet steel. "People like her will never change. Not because they can't, but because people like you make it harder for them to believe they're worth saving." The woman's face crumpled, and she took another step back, her once dominant presence reduced to a faint shadow. The crowd murmured in agreement, their disapproval now directed squarely at her. And though the moment was far from over, it was clear that the tide had turned, and that the reckoning she so desperately deserved was just around the corner. The silence following Elon's pointed words was deafening. The crowd's judgmental eyes bore into the woman, who stood frozen, her previously ironclad confidence unraveling in the face of overwhelming disapproval. Yet, rather than retreating with grace, she summoned what little defiance she had left and leaned into her bitterness. "Enough with the sanctimonious speeches," she hissed, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a sharp blade. "You're all so eager to play the hero, but none of you know what it's like to deal with people like her every day. The entitlement, the lies, the games they play to get what they want. It's exhausting." Elon didn't flinch at her venom. Instead, he stepped closer, his towering presence casting a long shadow over her. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his tone was unmistakable. "The only entitlement I see here," he said, "is yours. You talk about exhaustion, but you're not the one living on the streets, wondering where your next meal will come from. You're not the one being judged, dismissed, and dehumanized at every turn." The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement, and the woman's face flushed with anger and humiliation. She opened her mouth to respond, but Elon raised a hand, cutting her off. "Do you know why people like Mia end up on the streets?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with quiet intensity. "It's not because they're lazy or entitled. It's because the system is broken. And instead of fixing it, we've created a culture that blames the victims for their own suffering." The woman's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "And what would you know about suffering?" she spat. "You stand here in your expensive clothes, pretending to care, but you're just another rich man trying to buy his way into heaven." The crowd gasped at her audacity, and a few people shook their heads in disbelief. Elon, however, remained unshaken. He studied the woman for a moment, his expression unreadable, before speaking again. "You're right," he said finally. "I've been lucky. I've had opportunities that most people can only dream of. But that doesn't mean I don't care. And it doesn't mean I'll stand by and let someone like you tear down a young girl who's already been through more than you could imagine." His words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. The crowd was silent now, their eyes fixed on the woman as they waited for her response. But she seemed at a loss for words, her gaze darting around as if searching for an escape. Before she could speak, a voice from the crowd broke the silence. "Who do you think you are anyway?" A young man called out. "Standing here, judging someone you don't even know. You're the one who looks entitled." The woman's head snapped toward the source of the voice, her eyes blazing with fury. "I'm entitled?" she shot back. "You don't know anything about me. I've worked for everything I have. I've earned my place in this world." "And what place is that?" the young man retorted. "The place where you tear other people down to feel better about yourself?" The crowd murmured in agreement, and the woman's cheeks burned with anger and embarrassment. She looked back at Elon, her voice shaking with frustration. "This is ridiculous. You're all ganging up on me like I'm the villain here." "No one made you the villain," Elon said calmly. "You did that yourself." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and the woman's posture stiffened. It was clear that she was losing control of the situation, and her attempts to regain it only made her look more desperate. But instead of backing down, she lashed out one final time. "You think you're so much better than me," she said, her voice rising. "But you're just as hypocritical as everyone else. You talk about kindness and empathy, but all you're doing is making a spectacle out of this girl's pain." Elon's expression didn't change, but there was a flash of something, disappointment, perhaps, in his eyes. He turned to the crowd, his voice steady and clear. "This isn't about making a spectacle," he said. "It's about shining a light on a problem that too many people choose to ignore. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe it's time to ask yourself why." The crowd fell silent, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. The woman stood frozen, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to respond but couldn't find the words. The balance of power had shifted completely, and it was clear that she had no way to recover. Elon turned back to Mia, crouching down to meet her eyes. "Mia," he said gently, "you don't have to listen to her. You're stronger than you know, and you deserve so much more than this." Mia nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for standing up for me." Elon smiled softly, his presence a steady source of comfort. But as he straightened, his expression hardened once more, his gaze locking onto the woman who had caused so much pain. "You had the chance to show compassion," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But instead you chose cruelty. And that says more about you than it ever could about her." The woman's face crumpled, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his words. She looked around, her eyes darting to the crowd as if searching for someone, anyone, to come to her defense. But the faces staring back at her were cold and unsympathetic, their judgment unmistakable. For the first time, she seemed to realize that she was truly alone. Her pride had driven her to this point, but now it was her downfall. And though she didn't say another word, the humiliation on her face spoke volumes. Elon turned back to Mia, his presence shielding her from the woman's lingering venom. "You're not alone," he said softly. "Not anymore." Mia nodded, her tears finally spilling over. For the first time in months, she felt seen, not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be dismissed, but as a person with worth and dignity. The crowd watched in silence as the woman turned and walked away, her once confident stride now hesitant and unsure. The moment was far from over, but her downfall was complete, and the lessons of this encounter would linger long after the street had emptied. The woman's retreat was slow, her once confident posture crumbling under the weight of the crowd's judgment. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked unsure of herself, her defiance replaced with an unmistakable vulnerability. Yet, She wasn't ready to admit defeat, not entirely. Her pride, though battered, still clung to the shreds of her argument. As she turned back toward Elon, the crowd fell silent again, the air charged with anticipation. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, now wavered as she spoke. "You all think you're so much better than me," she said, her tone defensive and hollow. "But you're not. You're just hiding behind your applause and your self-righteousness, pretending you care because it's convenient." Elon didn't respond immediately. He studied her for a moment, his calm demeanor unshaken by her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and measured, cutting through the tension like a blade. "This isn't about being better than anyone," he said. "It's about recognizing that we all have a choice. Every word we speak, every action we take, it either lifts someone up or tears them down. And today you chose the latter." The woman flinched, the truth of his words striking a nerve. She opened her mouth to argue, but no response came. The crowd's disapproving murmurs grew louder, and a few people began to step forward, emboldened by Elon's unwavering stance. "Do you even hear yourself?" a man near the front of the crowd said, his tone incredulous. "You've been tearing into a homeless girl like it's a sport, and for what? To prove a point? To make yourself feel superior?" The woman turned to glare at him, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. "I'm not trying to feel superior," she snapped. "I'm just being realistic. Someone has to say it." "Realistic," another voice chimed in, a middle-aged woman holding the hand of a young child. "What's realistic about tearing someone down when they're already at their lowest? You talk about responsibility, but where's yours?" The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder and more united. The woman's attempts to defend herself grew weaker with each passing moment, her confidence unraveling under the collective weight of their disapproval. Elon, meanwhile, remained calm, his gaze unwavering as he addressed her once more. "You said earlier that kindness doesn't pay the bills," he said. "But let me tell you something. Cruelty doesn't solve problems. It only creates more. And today you've shown everyone here what that looks like." The woman's face twisted with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She glanced around, her eyes darting from one disapproving face to another, searching for an ally. But the crowd had turned against her completely, their judgment unyielding. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice rising in desperation. "You don't know what I've been through. I've worked hard for everything I have, and I'm not going to apologize for it." "No one's asking you to apologize for your success," Elon replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "But success doesn't give you the right to look down on others. It doesn't give you the right to strip someone of their dignity just because they're struggling." The woman's shoulders sagged, her defiance finally giving way to defeat. She looked around once more, but the faces staring back at her offered no sympathy. The crowd's judgment was clear. Her actions had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. A young man near the edge of the crowd stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "You're so focused on proving a point that you've forgotten what it means to be human," he said. "We've all struggled at some point. The difference is, most of us don't use that as an excuse to tear other people down." The woman's gaze dropped to the ground, her face pale and expressionless. The fight had gone out of her, and she stood there, exposed and vulnerable, as the crowd's words continued to echo around her. Elon turned back to Mia, his presence a shield against the lingering hostility. "You don't have to listen to her anymore," he said softly. "Her words don't define you." Mia nodded, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Thank you." The crowd began to shift, their focus returning to the young girl who had borne the brunt of the woman's cruelty. A few people stepped forward, offering small gestures of kindness: a bottle of water, a sandwich, a warm jacket. Their actions were quiet but powerful, a stark contrast to the woman's earlier venom. The woman watched in silence, her expression unreadable. She seemed torn between anger and shame, her pride warring with the growing realization of her own wrongdoing. But there was no redemption in the crowd's eyes, no path to undo the damage she had done. Her downfall was complete, her reputation irreparably tarnished. As the crowd began to disperse, Elon turned to the woman one final time. His gaze was steady, his voice calm but resolute. "You have a choice," he said. "You can let this moment define you, or you can let it teach you. But whatever you decide, remember this: the world doesn't need more cruelty. It needs more kindness." The woman didn't respond. She stood there, her hands trembling at her sides, as the weight of his words settled over her. The lesson had been delivered, but whether she would learn from it remained to be seen. Mia, meanwhile, stood beside Elon, her small frame no longer trembling. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe, protected not just by Elon's presence, but by the kindness of strangers who had stepped forward to stand by her side. It was a moment she would never forget, a turning point in her young life that would shape her future in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, the crowd slowly began to disperse, leaving behind a scene that would linger in their minds long after they had gone. The woman, once so confident and unyielding, stood alone, her pride shattered and her actions laid bare for all to see. The lesson was clear: cruelty may bring temporary power, but it never wins in the end. Elon Musk's powerful actions remind us of the profound difference one person can make by standing up for what's right, even when it's not easy. But let's take a moment to reflect on the deeper lessons embedded in this story. What does it say about us as a society when kindness and empathy are seen as weaknesses? And what can we do to ensure moments like this inspire change, not just for one person, but for all of us? First, this story highlights the importance of empathy, something that often feels lost in the rush of daily life. When Elon stood up for Mia, he wasn't just helping her in the moment. He was challenging a mindset. How often do we find ourselves judging others without knowing their struggles? It's easy to assume the worst, as the antagonist did, but it takes courage to ask, "How can I help?" This story challenges us to stop and think before we judge. Everyone is fighting battles we can't see, and sometimes, a small act of kindness can be the spark that reignites hope in someone's life. Second, this story reminds us of the power of standing up to cruelty. Elon could have walked away. He could have chosen silence. But he didn't. He stayed, confronted the antagonist, and used his voice to defend someone who couldn't defend themselves. His actions remind us that silence in the face of cruelty is complicity. If we want a world where kindness prevails, we have to be willing to speak up, even when it's uncomfortable. So the question for all of us is, when was the last time you stood up for someone? And what will you do the next time you see someone in need? Finally, this story shows us the ripple effect of kindness. Elon's actions inspired others to step forward and help Mia. From the man offering her water to the crowd's growing support, we saw how one person's decision to act can set off a chain reaction of goodness. Imagine if each of us chose to be that spark. What kind of world could we create if we stopped focusing on what divides us and started building bridges of compassion instead? Now, here's where you come in. What are your thoughts on today's story? Do you agree that kindness is a strength, not a weakness? Have you ever been in a situation where someone's cruelty made you feel small, or where someone's kindness lifted you up? Share your experiences in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about how we can all do better together. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends. Let's spread the message of kindness far and wide. And, of course, if you're not already part of our community, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that inspires change. Because at the end of the day, we all have the power to make a difference. Let's use it wisely.